Hello Year 9 and welcome to this whole class feedback video on your knowledge quiz that you submitted as part of Remote Learning Task 8. I'm going to be talking through the questions and answers with you to plug any knowledge gaps you may or may not have, and then I'm going to be talking through the whole class feedback based on what your teachers have told me about your answers. So the first few questions were on our slavery topic that we looked at the beginning of Year 9. So first of all, you had to give one example of a tribe that we had studied of African people that had been captured for slavery. So you would have received a mark if you had written any one of these: Igbo, Temne and Benin. After being captured, where were slaves taken? Well, they were taken to prisons on the coast of Africa, and then they were put on slave ships where they would travel across the Middle Passage and either arrive at plantations in the Caribbean or America. So any one of those would have got you a mark. Name 3 products which were grown on slave plantations. Now you could have had rice, sugar, tobacco or cotton. For any 3 of those was 3 marks. Give examples of 2 roles, so jobs slaves had on plantations: slave driver, carpenter, labourer, cook, domestic worker, looking after slave children. Some of you also gave examples of specific jobs they had within, either harvesting cotton or preparing the sugar, for example. So I still gave a mark for that because that detail was brilliant. Who were the Maroons? Now the Maroons were slaves who escaped their plantations and formed a resistance movement against plantation owners. They were led by a woman known as Nanny, Queen of the Maroons. Then we moved on to World War I, more specifically what happened with the end of World War I and afterwards. So give one reason for World War I ending and explain how that reason led to the end of the war. Question, and not just one reason. Some of you didn't get full marks on this because you didn't explain how it led to the war ending. So German food shortages, known as the turnip winter, the Allied naval blockades, that's where navy ships from Britain would prevent supplies getting to Germany, so almost trying to starve them out, which obviously had the desired effect with the food shortages and the turnip winter. The US decision to enter the war after a German U-boat sank a passenger ship, the Lusitania. Then the German army trying to have one last offensive before the US entered, but they pushed too far too quickly into France and didn't have the supplies to back up and support their soldiers. So they overstretched themselves. So an example of explaining how it led to the end of the war, you could say the Allied naval blockade led to a lack of food supplies, and then the turnip winter in Germany, which all contributed to a lower morale and therefore less motivation to fight and continue, hence Germany signing the armistice. Give 3 terms of the Treaty of Versailles and explain why German people objected to each of them. Again, great recall here of the terms of the treaty, but less great when it came to explaining why that specific term annoyed the German people or aggravated them. So we like to think of this as lamb, to remember the terms. They lost land, they lost their colonies. This was humiliating for Germany as a proud imperialist power. You may remember when we looked at causes of World War I that Germany was desperate to carve themselves a place in the sun, as they called it, and they wanted an empire that rivaled Britain's. Army, their troops were reduced to 100,000 men. This was particularly humiliating for Germany because they had an army of over 2.2 million before World War I. It also made them feel quite vulnerable to attack because remember they're now surrounded by a sea of enemies because they've lost the war, but they don't have the troops to defend themselves should they need to. Money, they had to pay 6.6 billion in reparations. This crippled the economy, which was already struggling because of the war, and it would have saddled future generations with debt and high taxation. So they're particularly aggrieved at that. Blame. Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles said that Germany had to accept all the blame for starting World War One. This was seen as very unfair because Germany was entering the war to support its allies. We know this is very unfair because we've looked at the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which actually kicked off the July crisis and triggered World War One. What was the purpose of the League of Nations? To prevent war between countries and prevent countries invading one another. Unfortunately, it did not fulfil its purpose. Reason being, well, after World War One, countries in the League of Nations were not willing to pledge their troops to enforce and back up the League if they made a decision or a sanction towards a particular country. And then countries knew this. They knew that the League would not use military force, so therefore they just act with little consequence. They did what they liked, basically. They pushed boundaries, as we saw with Abyssinia and the Manchurian crisis. USA, which actually was, the League was the brainchild of the US president at the time, Woodrow Wilson. The US didn't join because they were worried about being dragged into another European war. But because this US was the most powerful and influential country at the time, the League didn't have that power. And if the League was to issue an economic sanction to a country, economic sanctions wouldn't be effective because the countries could still trade with the US. What were the two things Hitler wanted to achieve as leader of Germany? So 2 points needed here, but there are many to choose from. So, removal of the Jews and other groups labelled Untermenschen, destroy the Treaty of Versailles, rebuild Germany into a great nation, reunify the former countries in the German Empire in the Lebensraum, living space, and Third Reich. And so, an example of that might be your Anschluss with Austria, which some of you did give as examples, which was brilliant. What does appeasement mean? I think all of us had great definitions for this, pretty much. To allow someone to have something they want, so to give in to someone in order to maintain peace or keep the peace or avoid war, in this case. How did the Allies appease Hitler? They allowed Hitler to break the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, increasing the size of the German army. They also did not intervene with the invasion of Czechoslovakia, Austria, etc. The Allies didn't do anything. Then on to Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. 2 restrictions on the rights of Jewish people in Nazi Germany. Jews were not allowed to have passports, they were prevented from marrying non-Jews, they were forced to wear the Star of David. You'll remember from the story of Frank Bright that they were forced to sew this on their clothes, but they were only given one or 2 stars, so they had to unpick it every time and put it on a different piece of clothing. They were put under curfew and couldn't visit a number of places. And you remember with the Frank Bright story that park benches were off limits, for example. They were prevented from being doctors, lawyers and teachers. That is literally, unfortunately, just a handful of the restrictions. There are many, many more, which I'm sure your teachers will have credited if you'd put them. What was the ghetto? Now this, I will clarify this in the whole class feedback, but low quality slum housing on the outskirts of cities where Jews were forced to live separate from the rest of population. So it says German population here, but as you know, they also formed in Prague, where when we heard Frank's story, they formed across Europe as the Nazis took over more countries, often walled off from the rest of the population as well. What was the final solution? So this is important that we get this right because some of us struggled on this. So the final solution to the Jewish question was the name of it, and it was the Nazis' plan to mass murder, they used the word exterminate, the Jewish population in Europe during World War One. Not just the Jews in Germany, it's across Europe. So it's the transition from concentration camps to actually death camps. Give to other groups of people who were targeted by the Nazis during the Holocaust. I think we're all very good at being able to label other groups here. So you could have had homosexuals, disabled people, mentally ill, Gypsy and Roma, Sinti community, communists, black people, political opponents, Poles, a whole host of other groups that were targeted by the Nazis. Historical significance inquiry, when we looked at Churchill, the 5 R's, remarkable. So it is remarked on at the time, it is unique, It results in change, it leads to change, it has an impact on history. It is revealing, so it shows to us something about the past, perhaps indirectly or directly. It is a window into the past. Resonant, so there is an emotional connection with it, and we make analogies to it now. It resonates with us, it has an emotional impact on us. It is remembered, so we remark on it is remembered now, so there might be a statue or a film about it, for example. Using one of the 5 R's, give one way, Winston Churchill could be seen as significant. So you could have said his decision to travel to the Western Front after Gallipoli was remarkable. His role in the Battle of Britain resulted in change. Role in initiatives such as state pensions and national insurance resulting in change. Role in World War II, resonant, like we draw comparisons to it now. Often his speeches are referred to. Massive state funeral, clearly remembered. Statue outside Parliament, remembered. Any one of those, or if he had something different but was still valid, your teachers will have credited it. Using one of the 5 R's, give one way, Winston Churchill could not be seen as significant. So you could have said that voting against votes for women, Gallipoli, the failure, the handling of the strike with the Tony Pandy riots, because they are negative things. But a good example I saw, I think this was Charlotte, she had voting against votes for women was revealing, and it was not significant because it didn't result in change. The Cold War, allies becoming enemies. When did World War II begin and end? 1939 to 1945. Give 2 features of a communist country. So equality, businesses and institutions are owned by the state. There is not political freedom and generally not freedom of speech or press. And on the flip side, 2 features of a capitalist country. Inequality, businesses are privately owned, there is political freedom, and there is freedom of speech and press. What happened to Germany and Berlin following World War II? So we had Tehran, Yalta and Potsdam conferences, which led to the division of Germany and Berlin into 4 zones divided by the Allies, Britain, the US, France and USSR, so Russia. Why did the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki damage relations between the USA and USSR? So Stalin saw this attack as a threat against the USSR, as Truman did not make Stalin aware that they had this nuclear capability, which in theory he should have done because they were allies working together to defeat Japan. The atomic bomb gave Truman the confidence to be harder on his anti-communist line, so he felt that he had some leverage there to almost intimidate Stalin. It led to breakdowns in talks between the Allies and the USSR following the conferences, so it was harder for them to reach an agreement. So Mao's China, your most recent topic. Give 2 policies from Mao's great turn for making China into a great nation. So we had the Great Leap Forward, which was designed to increase industrial and agricultural output. Obviously, we know that this led to farming communities and people working in factories being forced to lie and exaggerate targets to show that they'd met the expectations. Those who didn't do this were tortured and killed. There was also a massive famine as a result of the failings of the Great Leap Forward. Cultural Revolution, so to purge impure elements and revive the revolutionary spirit. Young people recruited, forced to dress in a certain way and enforce these rules even further. Then anyone that didn't fit would be sent to the reform through labour camps. Terrible conditions, little food, the hope being that they could fit into the revolutionary ideal. But as we know from Young Chan's testimony, there were horrific places to be and many people died in those camps. So now for the summary of what went really well and just the addressing of any misconceptions or mistakes that were made. So first of all, great recall of knowledge from the start of Year 9. A lot of you had details about the experiences of Africans captured for slavery. ED, your answer to question 6 about reasons for World War I ending and then explaining why that led to the end of World War I. You said the turnip winter in Germany lowered morale and weakened the country. In terms of the Treaty of Versailles, many of you were great at remembering the key detail in those different terms for the treaty. I think the acronym LAM is really important because it sets out land, army, money and blame, and also if you think of Germany as a little lamb to the slaughter, with their fate being decided by the Allies. Millie, your answer to question 7. Specifically, you explained why each term of the Treaty of Versailles would cause discontent in Germany. Alorm, you had great detail in your answers, which Mrs. Menhinnick was really impressed with. A clear, correct definition of appeasement from the majority of pupils, fantastic. Ellie May and Ellie F. Mrs. Menhinnick was very impressed with specific examples of how Britain and France appeased Hitler. I was really impressed with the range of people that were able to remember the other groups that were targeted in the Holocaust beyond the Jewish population. Many in my class could understand the gravity of the atomic bomb and why that would cause friction between the USA and the USSR. Madeline, Miss George was really impressed with the key historical terms you used, for example, your reference to Bolshevik when talking about the Russian Revolution. Now, misconceptions and mistakes. This is relevant to this test and beyond, really. So, some of you were too general. You need to be specific. It's not good enough to say Hitler wanted land. You can make your answer even more precise by saying Hitler wanted to recover the territory lost in the Treaty of Versailles, or Hitler desired to create Lebensraum, living space, for Germans in his Third Reich. And then your understanding of the 5 R's. Remember, I've gone through this already. Remarkable, resonant, results in change, revealing, and I've forgotten the last one. And remembered. I didn't remember. That's funny. Correctly defining the ghetto in Nazi Germany. I've gone through the answer for that, but remembering that it's separate from the city. It's not necessarily just a place to house the Jewish population before they're taken to the concentration camp. That did often happen, but they were just to dehumanise and segregate them before that. Russian Revolution and the end of World War I, so understanding the relationship between the two. Now, Russia was fighting on the side of Britain and France. They had a revolution in February 1917, then another one in October, but what this did is sort to weaken the Russian commitment to the war, and then eventually they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which led to them surrendering to the Germans. So this actually bolstered the German offensive because they now only had to fight on one front. They weren't fighting on the Eastern Front, it was just the Western Front. And probably encourages them to overstretch themselves a little bit more in France when they don't have enough supplies. And they try to make that attack before the US get involved, having sunk their passenger ship, the Lusitania. Many of you identified that the Germans thought these were unfair, but why specifically were the Germans feeling aggrieved by this? So this question about terms of the Treaty of Versailles and which terms actually annoyed the Germans, it's not good enough to say, oh, it's unfair or it's harsh. You need to say specifically why it annoyed them, and I did that in the bit at the start of the video. Reading the full demands of the question. So an example being you had to give a reason for World War I ending and explain why it led to the end of the war. Now, some of you gave a reason but then didn't explain why it led to the end of the war. Understanding what the final solution is. Some of you correctly identified that this was the murder of Jews, but then you said it was in Germany. This was the solution to the Jewish question in Europe. So where they changed from just persecuting the Jews to actually planning to exterminate the Jews in Europe. Key terms that were misspelt. So revealing, morale, remember without the E it just becomes moral. British, using that appropriately when talking about Allied effort in the war. It's not just the English, it's British. Churchill, reparations and suffrage. So for this task, make sure you've listened to the answers that I've gone through in the previous part of the video, the reasons for them, and then add the correct answers to your test in a different coloured pen. So now I'm going to talk through the pupils that your history teachers have identified as either getting full marks, close to full marks, or putting in excellent effort and detail into your quiz. Lucy, Olivia, Sienna, Jazz, Ryan, Mitchell, Charlotte, Amy, Charlotte, Bo, Sophia, Alorm, Lily, Julia, Ella, Angela, Katie, Riley, B, Isabel, Riley, Sam, Abigail, Cameron, Emmy, Millie, Lily. Now obviously we would love to talk about everyone because you all did so well, but these are just a few stars that have been selected by your teachers. Well done Year 9, you all did fantastically well. Make sure you modify your answers in a different coloured pen based on this video.